Hey everyone, welcome to Be the Change. My name is Lily Mott, and today's episode is about how change comes when you're married to the problem, not the solution. I am so excited to share this week's episode with you today. This episode was meant to come out last week, but life got chaotic, and as I was editing, I was really enjoying putting together this episode, and I just learned so much from talking with this guest. So I postponed the episode for this week because I just wanted to make sure that I had enough time to edit, record my own reflections, and really just process this conversation fully. So with that little explanation, let me introduce you to this week's guest. Ashleigh Streeter-Jones is an activist, founder, speaker, writer, and advisor who is, to quote Ashleigh, lifting the floor to close gender inequality gaps locally, nationally, and internationally. I learned so much through this conversation, and I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I did. So without further ado, let's get started with this episode featuring Ashleigh Streeter-Jones.
Hi, my name's Ashleigh Streeter-Jones. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm today on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Naarm in Melbourne, Australia. I am a friend, a daughter, a partner, an optimist, a change maker, a founder, a volunteer, and everything in between. And I feel really passionately about starting with that because I have spent many years learning to unpin my self-worth from my work. I think this is a journey that I will stay on because work is so pivotal to who we are. But for me, work is also how I live my values. So I run a volunteer-run social enterprise called Raise Our Voice Australia. And we exist to mobilise young women and gender diverse people to transform policy and politics. So we do this through education, building community, campaigns, research, and policy to try and further our vision of equitable democracy.
I love that. That was a wonderful intro, and I think all of the different parts of who you are so important, and I love that you started out with that. I also love optimist. I think that's just wonderful. Yeah, I love that little list, and I'm excited to dive in a little bit more into your work and how you manage to balance everything as well. I think that'll be really interesting to talk with you about. Can you tell me a little bit more about what got you started with this work in general? What was that journey like for you to get started with Raise Our Voice, but also just doing change making and social impact work in general?
So I was raised in a very political household. I'm the daughter of expats and of migrants, and I use those both deliberately because I think expat is quite a classist word, really, for migrants. So trying to challenge that a little bit. My parents have lived overseas in a range of locations. I've also lived in a bunch of locations, but settled in Australia when I was quite young. And around our dinner table, because of our global perspective, I was raised having conversations not just about Australian politics, but UK politics and South African politics and Zimbabwean politics. And what this created in me was a real interest in systems. And I was always encouraged to have an opinion and to learn more and to challenge and be part of those conversations. So this instilled in me a real interest, not just how in systems make and break equality, although that was an interest I developed quite young from doing travel and, having the absolute privilege of seeing a variety of contexts, but also to have a voice, have an opinion, and think about the agency that I had. So I developed this interest at 11 years old. It wasn't a very cool interest to have. I can't say that my friends necessarily joined me at that spot on my journey. But when I was 18, when I was at university, I really thought, okay, I want to delve down into this change making. I thought about it a little bit through careers counselling and the degree I chose, but I didn't have great careers counselling at school. So I wanted to be a human rights lawyer or a Pokemon trainer growing up. And I'm disappointed to say that I've achieved neither of them, but I think I've had a good journey despite not reaching that goal. So I started volunteering with VGen, World Vision Australia's youth movement, and focusing on supporting young change makers to use the asset that they had, which was time and not money, to create the shifts that they wanted to see. So I did that for a couple of years and reached a spot of burnout and asked myself, okay, I'm still really passionate about this problem, but how can I try solving it from a different standpoint? So I enrolled and did my master's in diplomacy, and I moved to Australia's capital, which was Canberra. And at that time, pivoted my work more to focus on youth and gender representation in politics. So I co-founded a movement called Girls Take Over Parliament, where we invited a bunch of federal politicians to have a young woman or gender diverse person take over their office for the day. So we wanted to start a conversation about the absence of young women and gender diverse folk from elected office, but also to encourage the young participants to ask that question, why not me? If democracy, again, is really about representation and communities, why not you? At that time, I also started a graduate role in the Australian Public Service, working in a foreign policy role, which again gave me an insight to a different way of making change and of approaching these problems. At the end of 2018, I'd been running this initiative, my first social enterprise with my co-founder and working full time. And I hit a really critical point of burnout. I was so burnt out. And at that time, decided to take a step back from the social enterprise and spend the next year really soul searching and asking myself the questions of what is the problem I'm really passionate about solving? What is already out there? And how am I best placed with my privileges, skills, networks, and expertise? How am I best placed to solve this particular problem? During this period, we also had some really significant bushfires in Australia. And when I was driving from Canberra down to Melbourne to see my family and Melbourne back up to Canberra, which is about an 8-hour drive, my partner and I were driving past parts of the road that were still on fire. And it was incredibly confronting. And I found myself asking this question, where would we be if some of these passionate young activists who I get to work with outside the public service had a seat at these tables and were influencing our climate policy, not just now, but 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? And I got back to Canberra and was percolating on this idea. And one day a mentor sat me down and she said, look, Ash, you've been in this thinking spot. You're talking about running this training program, helping young change makers better understand politics and using that experience, but also better understand government and public service and how you use that experience as well to be really effective change makers. So I hear you. You want to run this training program, but I don't think you actually know how to get there. So if you're serious about this, I will sit down with you every week and I will help you break down this mammoth task so you can put one foot in front of the other. And that's exactly what we did. And her name is Ritu Clementi. I will always give her a shout out because I wouldn't have got Rover, Raise Our Voice Australia, Rover off the ground without her support. So we kicked off that training program and it looked at leadership, domestic policy, foreign policy, and politics. We ran some practical examples, and really launching it was one of the most vulnerable things I've done. It was taking my own experience, and I should say as well, at the time, I'd been redeployed to work on COVID response, so I was very much in that domestic space. But taking something that was so personal right out of my brain and putting it out to the world, and it was pretty terrifying. But that was where we started, and since then, we've continued to grow Raise Our Voice. We run Raise Our Voice in Parliament, a campaign where we partner with federal politicians who read speeches written by young people in federal parliament. We run community building, we run research reports. So really the work's continued to grow from there.
I love that. I think that that was such a wonderful overview. And I think there's so many questions that I want to ask just off the back of that story. The first one that comes to mind is as you were talking about, I mean, I think that you were working in such a tough time, especially in Australia, but of course around the world with the COVID pandemic. As you were saying, struggling with burnout at different periods. And I think my biggest question is just how did you stay so optimistic and kind of so forward thinking about this work? And it's wonderful that then you started working with young change makers. I'm just wondering, What was that like for you to keep doing this work every day? What did that feel like? What was that like? Do you have tips as well? I know that in other parts of the world now, this is very tricky. Me being from the US, I think a lot of people are facing feelings of hopelessness or like they can't do anything to make change. How did you stay so positive and how did you keep working towards making change in this way that you're now making it with Rova?
Ah, that is such a great question. And as you said, this is really the time that we're having these conversations, right? It is challenging. And of course, I do want to acknowledge that being a middle class white woman in Australia, the hand that I've been dealt is much cushier than many other people, and I do have a lot of privileges that I sit in there too. I'll be honest, I'm not always sitting in my optimism, but something I do have a lot of faith in is people. And when I think about what I need to be well and to do this work and sustain this work, I do have a lot of faith in communities. And I'm part of some wonderful communities of, again, hopeless, radical optimists. And I think you have to be to invest in change work, right? You've also got to be audacious enough to think that you can be part of a solution, to look at a problem and go, "Oh, I think I can play a role in shifting that." That requires a pretty healthy dose of audacity. And I think audacity is a great quality. But I heard an analogy a few years ago, and I cannot remember who it came from. I think I first heard it, I think, from an Australian feminist called Clementine Ford. And I think it was an interview she was doing with our only woman Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. And she used this analogy of movement building. And when we're in movements and when we're in communities, it's like we're in a choir, and the choir is singing this song. And sometimes, as change makers, we will need to stop singing. We will need to step back. We will need to catch our breath. We will need to take a break. But the time comes when we get to rejoin that choir again. And perhaps when we rejoin, somebody else takes their turn to stop. But the beauty of that and the beauty of being in movements and communities is that the song continues. And I love that analogy because I think it's a really good reminder of the power of people. And when you are in a representative democracy or you are part of really active communities of people who share this vision for change, there is so much power in that, but also there is space if you do need to take that time out and have a break. And I'll be honest, I think I'm crossing fingers. This might be the first time since I was 18 that I'm about to break a cycle of burnout. And again, just in the interest of transparency, I think I've only done that because I've recently left my full-time job to focus on how I do my change making full-time and do something that is more values aligned. It's taken a lot of courage to make that jump. And again, a lot of privilege in noting that I am in a financial position where I can make this choice and it will be temporary. And I am very much in the process of looking for other jobs. But to be able to take that break and go, how do I sustain this? How do I sustain my work? How do I make sure that I can be well enough to do the work I want to over the long term? Because this work needs us, it needs us to be well. And when we are well, we become the vehicle for that optimism again, and we can be that loud voice in the choir.
I love that choir analogy. I think that that is beautiful. And I think it speaks so well to that idea that we're a part of movement and there are communities out there and people who care so deeply about the same issues that you care about. Maybe they're addressing them in a different way, but they care so much and they're with you in this. You're not alone. There are so many people that you could reach out to as well to get involved in your work, and that you, if you're someone who isn't involved in movements yet, but you want to be, there is a choir out there who you can join and they would be so happy to have you. I think that's so wonderful. As far as the burnout factor, I think the biggest question, just as you were talking about this cycle of burnout, are there questions that you ask yourself, or are there kind of signals for yourself where you realize, okay, I need to take a break, I need to engage in something else? What is that process like?
Uh, I was silently laughing as you were talking, and you really think after spending 13 years in cycles of burnouts, I would have the answer for this. My wonderful fiance is also a psychologist, so you'd think I'd have greater self-awareness. I think the challenge around burnout is that it can creep up on you. And when you are really passionate about what you're doing, and look, I probably shouldn't, but I do say to too many people that I think burnout is an occupational hazard of being a passionate person. And Passionate people find themselves in a lot of places, and it doesn't really matter what you're passionate about. Passion makes you want to run at something and give it your fullest self and give it a lot of emotional energy, and you find your people there and it becomes that community. But I think because burnout is so prevalent, I'm a really big believer in being upfront about that. And again, reflecting on something I heard a few years ago in a leadership program I was doing, the facilitators talked about the messy middle. And I've thought about this a lot over the years because I think yes, as change makers or as founders or as people going through life, the messy middle is the most human part of any process. When we start, we're not necessarily all starting at the same block and we're not walking to the same end, but that messy middle where things are just chaotic and all over the place and you don't really know what's happening and you're hanging on for dear life, trying to make sense of it all. We've all found ourselves there. It is the most natural part, in a sense, of the process. But your question was, what are my markers of realizing that I'm in that burnout stage? I had a pretty decent one last year where after a period of taking some annual leave, I came back to Australia. I'd been overseas and was sitting on the end of my bed and just said to my partner, I don't have it in me to go back to work. I was feeling highly emotional. The brain fog was again monumental. I couldn't get enough sleep and sleep wasn't resting me. There was nothing I could do to actually fill my cup. So again, I was feeling very emotional. And when I'm in that place, I am sitting in a lot of values tension. And it becomes a values tension for me because as I mentioned from the top, I love my people. I love my community. I want to be a good friend, a good daughter, a good partner, a good sister. I want to show up for my communities. I want to be a good leader for the teams that I have amazing privilege to lead. But when I'm in that place, I cannot do that. I'm not showing up for them. I'm not showing up for myself. I'm not showing up for my cause. I can't think straight. I can't be ahead of the team. I'm very much being reactive, and people aren't getting what they need from me. And I'm not showing up in a way that I'm proud of. I don't like being that version of myself. So, those markers at that time, I think, were very much where my energy levels were sitting. It was how I felt about going into that situation. For me, it gives me a lot of anxiety. It's that, oh my goodness, I'm on that hamster wheel. I cannot get off. And then what? Do I just keep running until everything implodes? How do I show up tomorrow? And it's that anxiety of going, oh my goodness, this is what my day looks like, and I don't know if I can do it. It is, again, going to bed and realizing that nothing is restorative. It is a flare up of my chronic pain condition, which I've learned over the years is very much linked to my emotional state. At times when I'm feeling that anxiety or that heightened emotion, that pain flares up. So, again, that body mind connection. That being said, that burnout has looked different over the years. So, I imagine this is a journey I will stay on, and that actually a lot of change makers we do end up staying on because, again, burnout is an occupational hazard of being a passionate person. And as those circumstances change, the choices that I can make around that will continue to change as well. So I will say that and probably just finish this reflection by saying this will be an ongoing journey. This is where I'm sitting today, but that will look different probably in 6 months and again in 12 months.
That makes so much sense, and just being in tune with yourself and checking in and just making sure that it is that body mind connection. I think that was so important that you said that. You've shared so much wonderful advice, and I think your vulnerability as well to just talk about these things is just so wonderful. So thank you for that. Just as a personal note, as a host, I think it's been just so wonderful to talk with you about these things through your work with Raise Our Voice Australia and all of the work that you've done in the change making space. I think you've done so many different things, and I think that you just will have a wonderful answer for this. What advice would you want to share with young people who might want to get started in change making, but might not know how to get started, where to get started with that work? What advice would you want to share with them?
Find your people. There are so many great people out there, and I didn't go into this work perhaps looking to lead. That was where I found myself because it turns out, fortunately, there's a lot of things that I want to do. And if I didn't see them there, then I created them. But actually, I've learned a lot of my lessons and a lot of my career through working with other people. And, you know, being a leader is hard. And there are times and or some circumstances where I'm a leader, and actually a lot of circumstances where I get to be part of a team. And it's getting to be part of a team. It's having those people that you can celebrate with and commiserate with and make mistakes with and grow with. That's where a lot of the learning comes from, particularly in those early days. So, and again, those people can be your hope. So I think my one key bit of advice for people starting out is finding your people. But if I can be cheeky and add another one, be married to the problem, not the solution. That, again, is one of the best bits of advice I've ever been given. And that's what I think I've continued to do throughout my journey. You know, I started in one place and I still very, very much care about those issues. But as I have gone through life, and again, as my skills, knowledge, and expertise have shifted, the solutions that make the most sense for me and actually my greatest value add to solving some of these challenges has continued to shift. And giving yourself the grace to walk away or know when to call time when a way of making change is no longer a great fit for you. And recognizing that actually that in itself is growth, that in itself is maturity. And that's not to say that you'll be a less effective change maker. It will actually make you a more effective one. So give yourself permission to be married to that problem, but also know when the solution is not the best one for you anymore.
I really enjoy talking with Ashleigh, and I think her story is so inspiring to me. At every turn in her story, Ashleigh identified a problem in her life or the lives of those around her, and she's taken the steps to make change in a way that makes sense for her, which is exactly what this podcast is all about. I want to leave you with one last piece of advice that Ashleigh shared, because it's one that really stuck with me since we had our conversation. It's so important, especially in activism, advocacy, and other forms of social action work, to constantly be trying to adapt, grow, learn, and change in order to serve others and improve our constantly changing worlds. Change comes when you're married to the problem, not the solution. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and you can find Ashleigh on Instagram and LinkedIn, and I included those links in the description of this episode. If you want to talk about anything I mentioned, please reach out to me by email at lily@bethechangepodcast.org or on Instagram at Be the Change Media Network. I am constantly working on expanding Be the Change Media Network, which means bringing you more inspiring stories from amazing guests. If you enjoyed this episode, I would really appreciate it if you could leave the podcast a rating and a comment, because it will help these stories to reach, educate, and inspire more people. And I would also love to hear your thoughts and feedback. Tune in for my next episode, but until then, be the change you wish to see in the world. Bye, guys.